Okay. So, did you see my email last night? I sent around. Oh, wait a minute. I did the wrong lesson last week. I skipped ahead. We were supposed to do this lesson last week, and last week's lesson this week. So we're gonna go back and pick up last week's lesson. So the lesson we want to talk about is history and creeds. The word creed just means, I think it means belief, I believe. Credo means belief, you know. So we'll talk about creeds, like you've heard the Nicene Creed, the Apostles' Creed, the statements where we write down what we believe. So we'll talk about that a little bit. But first of all, we're going to talk about the history of Presbyterian Church. So the first thing that we really start, we could go all the way back to the Old Testament, but really what the start of the church was Pentecost. Remember Pentecost? That's that day after Jesus dies and rises again, and then the disciples gather and wait, and then the Holy Spirit comes. It's a day that we celebrate with Acts chapter 2, and it'll be later this spring. We'll remember Pentecost. So Pentecost is this moment when the Holy Spirit comes, and we think of that as, and the disciples are empowered, and then they go out from there and start to preach the gospel, and they start to bring people into the church. So it's really the birthday of the church. So that's when the church really began, was on Pentecost. That's one way we like to think. Of course, like I said, you could go all the way back to the Old Testament, to Abraham and Sarah and all that too, but Pentecost in the what we call the church really began then. Then they went into a time in the Roman world where it was pretty scary to be a Christian. Those first couple hundred years after Jesus' time on earth, the disciples were persecuted. All of the original 12 disciples, we think, were crucified or martyred in some way. They were killed for their faith. Peter, they say, was hung upside down. They crucified him, but they hung him upside down to make it even worse than Jesus, But you've heard about the lions in the Colosseum, and they would send Christians in there to be. So it was, and some emperors were worse than others, but generally it was a very dangerous thing. You had to be really careful. So if someone came up to you and said, "Hey, are you a Christian?" You had to be careful because maybe they were a spy for the government. Can you imagine? It would have been terrifying, right? So the church went underground in that time when it was dangerous to be a Christian, and yet the church still grew. Isn't that amazing? We found that in communist China, after World War II, China became communist, and Mao Zedong, I don't know if you've heard of him, he made it illegal to be a Christian, kicked out all the missionaries, wanted the Western church to get out of China, and made it illegal to be a Christian. So guess what? 30 years later, when China opened up again, there were way more Christians than there were 30 years earlier. Because somehow when it's underground and you need to be careful and you're being persecuted, sometimes the church is stronger in those times, So then something happened. There was somebody named Constantine. You ever heard of Constantine in history classes? Yeah. What happened to Constantine? You ever hear about that? He became a Christian.
I just heard the name.
Yeah, heard the name. Constantinople was what is now Istanbul, Turkey. Used to be called Constantinople, and it was after Constantine, because he was one of those Roman emperors of the eastern half of the Roman Empire. But he got this vision that Jesus wanted him to win the battle. It's kind of a strange story, but it was powerful because he became a Christian. He believed, and so from then on, he said, not only are we going to not persecute Christians, Christianity is going to be the official religion of the empire. So he went from being persecuted to being the official religion of the Roman Empire. So that was pretty weird. So, but it was good news and bad news. How would it be good news? Well, kind of obvious. You weren't gonna get killed anymore, right?
Yeah.
The bad news was, once it becomes the in thing to be a Christian, well, look, I got the emperor, I want to impress the emperor, I'm gonna go to church. So you go to church to impress the emperor, not to love God, you know? So the church became part of the empire. So then we developed, so then this emperor said, well, what is this new church that I want to be a part of, that I want to be official? What do we all believe? Because he heard a lot of different things about who Jesus was and who God the Father was and all this stuff. So he called all the bishops together, and they wrote the Nicene Creed in the 300 and in year 330 or something like that, in that era there. Constantine was like in 313, I think was the year he became a Christian. So in the early 4th century, in the 300s, that Nicene Creed was written, and we still have it today. So it kind of unites all Christians around the world, even though we believe kind of different things. We all can agree that the Nicene Creed kind of summarizes the faith. Then the church got organized. Okay, we've got to have presbyter. Remember that word? That's what we are, right? Presbyter. That just means elder. So the church got organized. Okay, we need elders to lead each local church. Then we need a bishop over that church, over a group of churches. And then we need a pope, a father over all of the root where there's papa or pope, Holy Father, over the bishops, over the elders, over the Christians. So the church is getting organized. And so that's the beginning of what we call the Roman Catholic Church, right? Coming out of Rome and that history. Then, you know what happens. Remember your history class? Did Rome last forever?
No.
Rome was sacked in like 400 something by the Visigoths, and then the eastern half remained for a while, and it evolved over time. But the glory days of Rome as this civilization out of Rome, Italy, fell apart, and there was very little organization in Europe. It all kind of fell apart into just local tribes and local warlords and stuff. So Europe entered what some don't like to use that term anymore because it wasn't all bad, but we use the term the Dark Ages or the Middle Ages. And that's from roughly 500 to 1500. So roughly 1,000 years Europe was just this place with no real authority, no real learning, no universities, no growth. It was just kind of stagnant. Of course, what else happened? The Renaissance and all that. Everybody woke up. Started reading books again. But in the middle of all that, there were some good people. And this is one of my favorites. There's some good people. St. Francis he was in the 11th or 12th century. 1200, so it would have been early 13th century. And he was in Italy, and he was probably the most Christ-like person since Jesus himself, I would say. Just the way he just gave up all his wealth. He was rich, and he just went and lived with the poor, and he served the poor for the rest of his life. He just was so kind, and so he loved nature, and he was just an amazing human being. So there's some bright lights throughout the Dark Ages, and he was one of them. Then things started to happen fast. Around 1500, a lot of things started to happen, right? 1492. What happened in 1492? Somebody sailed the ocean blue. Did you ever heard that poem? Yeah. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Do they teach that anymore? Okay, it's not. But that was when, so right around 1500, all this stuff starts happening. Columbus discovers the New World, and a lot of bad happened with that, but a lot of good happened with that too, obviously. Printing press is invented, people are reading again, universities are formed. It's just amazing how things just started to open up around that time. And a little monk in Germany named Martin Luther, said, we looked at the last 1,000 years of the Catholic Church and went, this is ridiculous. This isn't what the Bible teaches. This isn't what we're supposed to be doing. And he started this whole thing called the Reformation, right? We talked about that briefly. So John, and then another guy like him, who had the same sort of ideas, was, we've talked about before, is John Calvin. So you heard about the Lutheran Church, right? The other people who really followed Luther and stayed with his teachings. We followed more this guy, who came a little after Martin Luther, John Calvin. Do you remember what city he's in? Geneva. I think you were trying to say Geneva, right? I think it starts with G for Gemma or something. So he had to flee France because he was in trouble. The French king didn't like what he was teaching. France stayed Catholic, right? England became Protestant, sort of, and a lot of Germany became Lutheran and Protestant. Switzerland became largely Protestant, but France stayed Catholic, and they persecuted Protestant Christians. So everybody went, oh, let's get out of here, let's go to Geneva. So it's a beautiful city. We were there last summer. It's right on a lake, and it's just got this beautiful spirit. Like the UN is there now. A lot of peace negotiations and things happen in Geneva. It's a world-class city, even to this day. So part of that is because of, Calvin went there, and then a lot of refugees, like we talk about migrants and refugees now. A lot of refugees headed to Geneva because I think I told you the population grew from 10,000 to 30,000 in like a few years, just tripled. So Geneva, Calvin really tried to make Geneva the city of God. He gets a bad rap. We say he did some bad things, but, or not, that he was really a mean kind of bossy kind of guy. But he also had a real heart of compassion, and he built hospitals. He provided housing, schools for kids. So a lot of that sense of which government should provide for the needs of the people through housing and medicine and food and make sure that people are taken care of. A lot of that stems all the way back to Geneva, whereas before that, government was just for wars and taxes and, So Geneva was an important city in the development of our modern world. And John Knox, you heard about this guy. He had to leave Scotland. He's Scottish. He had to leave Scotland, and he went to Geneva, learned from John Calvin, then came back to Scotland and brought all his teachings back to Scotland. And so our roots, yeah, perfect. Yeah, you got those notes from last time. Yeah. And so this is a little bit of repeat, but a little bit different. I like doing these. So the Westminster, after John Knox came back to Scotland, and even England, although England went a little different direction, but Scotland stayed truly Presbyterian. And we developed the Westminster Catechism. We're talking about catechism, right? What you're reading is largely based on Westminster. So a catechism was written that really was the founding document for Presbyterians. And then I like this little map here. You'll recognize the East Coast of the United States. They're right in there. That says that then, after that, then all these immigrants came from Europe, right, to this country, and from Asia later. But initially, for Presbyterians, largely the people that came from Europe came to this country. And then missionaries went to Korea, and Korea became a stronghold of Presbyterianism, and then now Koreans have come back to this country as missionaries. We sent missionaries there, and now they're sending missionaries here. It's really cool. And then our Declaration of Independence was written, and our Constitution and so on. A lot of people think Presbyterian thinking went into a lot of what is in our American form of government.
The US.
Yeah. And so then there's an American church, the Presbyterian Church in America. So you're just following the line from Pentecost all the way through to us. So the American Presbyterian Church splits over, we talked about this, remember? What was the issue? 1800s. In the United States had a big war over it, Civil War. What was the Civil War about? There you go, slavery. And so again, the American Presbyterian Church split over slavery. Southern churches They liked their way of life. They said, well, this is okay. Bible talks about it, it's okay. And the northern churches went, no. Instead, we came back together. We split in the 1860s. We came back together in the 1980s. And we developed that logo that we looked at last week. So that's I'll look at that line of history that just so you can walk through all of that and get a quick overview of our journey from Pentecost all the way through to now. Okay, any questions about that? Yeah. I think that's neat. I think I was in Europe this summer. I visited Martin Luther's church. And before I've been to Assisi where St. Francis was from to see his little church. His little church they've maintained it inside. They built the cathedral around it. His little humble church that he built for the lepers, the people who had leprosy. So all the poor people that they built this little teeny church. They built a big cathedral right over it, so it's right inside the church. So I've seen St. Francis, I've seen Wittenberg, where Martin Luther's from. Stood in they don't let you stand in it, but I've been in the church where John Calvin preached. So, everything's so old in Europe, eh? 500 years old, church is still there. I was disappointed when I got to Martin Luther's church to learn that the church that Luther preached in burned down. And so it's a new one built 100 years ago or something. But the one that John Calvin preached in, still there. Still there. Okay, so that thing where it says we believe, Nicene Creed there, and so several points in our history, we had to stop and say, what do we believe? So here, the Emperor Constantine had to stop and say, what do we believe? So we got all the bishops together and said, let's write the Nicene Creed. And then once the Reformation through John Calvin and John Knox got to the British Isles, they said, this Presbyterian church, what do we believe? So we had to write down what we believed in this is now the 1640 or so. And then when we came back together as the Presbyterian church after that split, we had to write down again what we believe. So we're a church that we realize that from time to time, historical situations happen and the church needs to respond, and so we write down a statement of faith. And that's what we call the Book of Confessions. So when you're a Presbyterian, our constitution is 2 books. A book of order, which has all the rules about what we need to do to be a church, how to call a pastor, how to form a church, how to deal with issues, and so on. And then this book, the Book of Confessions, what do we believe? And so, if you opened it up and started reading, you go, wow, that's weird, I don't believe that. Because a lot of it is, 500-year-old stuff. So there's 3 sections in it. There's the early creeds, the Nicene Creed and the Apostles' Creed from the early church. And then there's a whole section from sort of the Reformation era around John Calvin, Martin Luther, and that whole time. And then there's some from the 20th century, more recently, and one from 1983. So what we're going to look at today are just 2 of them, the first one and the last one. So the first one was the Nicene Creed. Oh, did we only copy the... Wait a minute. Did you only get the... Oh, here it is. You only copied the one side. Shoot, I thought it was copying both sides. I've got another one here. Just a second. So there's one there. So the Nicene Creed, and I'll have it here in this book. The Nicene Creed is that oldest creed of the Christian church. After Constantine became a Christian, he said, oh, you have it there? Or wait a second, yeah, you don't need this, yeah. So Constantine said, we need a statement of faith. And it's really quite an amazing thing. He called bishops from all over Europe, what's now France, and from Jerusalem, and all over. They came to Constantinople, and he sat him down, and he sat in on the sessions even. So like for a couple of years, they sat around talking, and they came up with this statement. So here's the one side I did copy. It gives you a little history of that whole thing. Remember I said it was early 4th century, 312, Constantine won control of the empire. And then in 325, he called the council. And then in 381, a second council, and it revised and adapted it. So he gave us the Nicene Creed, which is really the oldest creed of the Christian church, and one that around the world, whether you're in Egypt or in India or in Russia, if you asked, do you believe in the Nicene Creed? Maybe they wouldn't even know what it was, but their leaders would know that, yeah, we affirm the Nicene Creed. So let's look at that together real quick. We won't study it in detail, but it's like so flip your page over there. There it is. Notice right off the bat, how many sections are there? 3, right? So what does that remind you of?
How many there's in it?
3. We keep using the word Trinity, right? God in 3 persons. So that's what this does. There's a paragraph about God the Father, a paragraph about God the Son, Jesus, and a paragraph about the Holy Spirit. So that pattern is so important to the church, because that was one of the main issues about the Nicene Creed is they had to solve the issue of Trinity. Because we say we're a monotheistic. What does the word monotheistic mean? Mono, one, theism, one God. Because in the Roman world there are lots of gods. You had the god of war, you had the god of the sea, you had the god of this and that, you had all kinds of gods. Christians and the Jewish religion, and then the Christian religion, and then even Islam later, all say we believe in one God. There's one deity that we worship, and so there's only one God. But then this Jesus guy's walking around, and we say he's God, and yet he prayed to God and talked to God as Father. So wait a minute, what is it? So it's confusing. So the Nicene Creed was an attempt to make sense of all of that. That there's a mystery here. We don't understand it completely. God is 3, and yet God is 1. We even say great 3 in 1. And I think that's kind of cool that, we've just lived with that. Not everything needs to be explained, right? I'm going to talk in my sermon today about a sunset. Yeah, you can explain a sunset, from physics and whatever, what's going on with the rays of the sun and reflecting off this, but that doesn't explain the moment of, wow, looking at the sun. And so all of this trying to explain who Jesus is, that he's both God. So to answer 2 questions, that God is 1 and yet God is 3, and that Jesus is both human and divine at the same time. So those are tricky questions to deal with, and the Nicene Creed attempts to explain that. So believe in God the Father, maker of heaven and earth, all that is seen and unseen. So just a statement about God being overall created, the creator of all that is. And then this paragraph about Jesus. And it really goes to great lengths to make sure we know it's only one, that Jesus was truly God. Because there was some people going around saying, yeah, he was a nice guy, but he wasn't really God. He couldn't be, because God is God. Well, no, wait a minute. We're saying he was eternally begotten of the Father, meaning he comes from the Father. He's God from God, light from light, true God from true God, begotten, not made, one being with the Father, 3. So they're really trying to drill home the point. This Jesus guy, he was God. He wasn't just a nice guy. He was God. And then this whole paragraph about what he came to do. He came for us and for our salvation. Came down from heaven, born of the Virgin Mary, became human, suffered under Pontius Pilate, dead, rose again, ascended into heaven, will come again to judge, and his kingdom will have no end. So this whole paragraph about who Jesus is. Then the last paragraph, Holy Spirit. And that's what kind of makes sense of the Trinity, that Jesus is now up in heaven. So how do we know what that means, and how do we connect where is heaven? Is that another place? Remember when my kids were little, Ninja Turtles were big at the time, and my son was trying to understand where heaven was. He said, maybe it's like Dimension X, which is, the turtles go through the wall and whoop, there's a whole other world in there. Okay, maybe that's a good answer. So anyway, the Holy Spirit connects it all. Jesus is with God the Father in heaven, but the Holy Spirit connects us to God. And so we feel the Spirit with us here now. So anyway, so that's the Nicene Creed. We don't say it very often in church. If we say anything, we say the Apostles' Creed, which was actually, some people think it was earlier. It was actually later. We say it in church because it's shorter. It's easy to memorize. Talk to your grandmother. She used to have to memorize it for confirmation. You guys got it easy. Then after this whole big book of all these statements throughout all those years, the Westminster Catechism and everything, my favorite is we come back to a brief statement of faith. So let me do that one. I think I copied that one. That's this one. Looks like Christmas on that paper. So this one, notice there's, if you skip that little introduction, how many paragraphs are there? 3, right? So there's 3 paragraphs, and then we gotta go. I gotta go get ready for church. But notice how there's an introduction, and then there's 3 paragraphs, but guess what paragraph is first? Does it start with God the Father? It starts with Jesus Christ. So it's just kind of a twist on that traditional way of understanding that God, we wanted to get away from this idea that it's a hierarchy of God the Father, and then under him is God the Son, and then the 3rd string guy is God the Holy Spirit. No. Wanted to get a sense that they're all 3 in 1, that they're all equal. So let's start with Jesus, since he's the focus of our faith, and then God the Father and God the Holy Spirit. So I've got to run and get ready for church. And here's a little booklet too, in addition to the one about the Bible. This one has a little bit of history, like what we've talked about. You can just keep it in your folder, read it when you have time, and I think you'll get something out of it.
For this, do I say, for the first part, I say the first reading, Psalm 51 through 6.
Perfect. And then just pause for a second, and then read. And read like you're talking to the person in the last row, because that way your voice is going to carry a little better. And then at the end you say, like in the bulletin, the word of the Lord, or this is the word of the Lord, or something like that. Perfect. Okay, good. Well, we'll have to, you guys get an extra star for being here. But everybody had a good reason today. We know where they were